Անցյալ երեքշաբթի Նյու Յորքի Սուրբ Վարդան Մայր տաճարը գերաշնորհ Սրբազան հայր Տեր Խաժակ arczepiskopos Պարսամյանի ղեկավարությամբ իր հյուրընկալ դռներն էր բացել Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունում Ամերիկայի Միացյալ Նահանգների դեսպան Ռիչարդ Միլսի առջև, որը ցանկություն էր հայտնել ծանոթանալ եւ իր ծրագրերով կիսվել նյույորքահայության հետ։ Հարգարժան հյուրին ներկայացրեց դոկտոր Դավիթ Նաջարյանը։
On September 16, 2014, Richard Mills was formally confirmed by the United States Senate to serve as the ambassador to the Republic of Armenia. His stellar diplomatic career is truly awe-inspiring. Interesting, although he obtained his JD and practiced law for a few years in Washington, he changed course and opted for a career in foreign services to better serve his country. In 1988, Ambassador Mills became a true diplomatic world traveler, beginning in Paris and going on places like St. Petersburg, Malta, of all the places, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Beirut, and finally landing on the foothills of Mount Ararat. I surmise that having lived in cities with large Armenian communities, Ambassador Mills acquired valuable knowledge of the Armenian ethos with its trials, tribulations, glorious history, and tragic demise during the Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Turks. He was, therefore, the best candidate to serve as the ambassador to the Republic of Armenia. Ambassador Mills was a nominee for the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Year Award in 2012 and the recipient of 9 Superior Honor Awards from the State Department. Without further ado, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to present to you the United States Ambassador to the Republic of Armenia, His Excellency Richard Mills.
Yisrachem Handipel Zeshet. That unfortunately is about as good as my Armenian gets right now. And I apologize. I hope next time I'm here with all of you, I can speak a bit more in Armenian. I have had the great privilege to serve as the U.S. Ambassador to Armenia for exactly 1 year this month. My wife, Lee, and I, and our new cat that we adopted in Armenia, Mash Totes, have been very touched by the warm welcome that we've received from all the Armenian people we've met. Living in Armenia, I've experienced firsthand the ethos of Armenian. Hospitality, good humor, fierce independence, love of country, and of course, a willingness to speak truth to power, which I suspect I might hear in action tonight. I arrived in Armenia last year after having been away from Armenia-U.S. issues for about 20 years. Some of you may have known, or if you had a chance to Google me before you arrived, I am old enough to have actually been on what was still called the Soviet Union desk back in the late 1980s. And as the Soviet Union collapsed, I became first the desk officer, which is just a fancy diplomatic term for the guy in charge for Georgia and Armenia, and then later just Armenia. So I had the great privilege of being, in effect, present at the birth of independent Armenia and the U.S.-Armenian relationship. What I want to do tonight in my remarks, before we have a chance to have some dialogue, is share with you my impressions of the progress and the challenges I see in Armenia after returning to the country, returning to these issues after 20 years. And then I want to share my 4 priorities as ambassador. The priorities that are going to drive the embassy's work over the remaining 2 years of my term, and will focus our assistance and our programs on. And as I describe these priorities, I want to highlight, when I can, possible areas where you, members of the Armenian-American community, might contribute, might amplify the work of the embassy, the messages that we're sending to the Armenian government and the Armenian people. Because I'll be frank up front, all of you, this community, what you say, what you think matters a great deal in Armenia. Armenians listen. So to the extent that we're in sync, it makes a great deal of progress possible. So let me begin. What have I noticed returning to Armenia after 22 years? Well, let me say up front, I was very struck by the enormous social, economic progress that Armenia has made since independence. Like many of you, I remember the privations, the challenges Armenians endured during those first years of independence, the dark years. I remember, as the desk officer, we had to fly food in to the first embassy staff that arrived in early 1992. We couldn't speak by phone to them. We had to wait till a satellite went over Yerevan, and we'd have 45 minutes to make a call to them. Of course, this was all pre-internet. Present-day life in Armenia, as all of you know, bears very little resemblance to that anymore. Quality of infrastructure, housing, education, government services, a litany of other areas are much improved. I think Armenia now has a government that strives to improve the provision of services to Armenian people. There is a very robust civil society that engages with the government on key issues. There's a very educated workforce that is internationally recognized for its expertise and its work ethic. Everyone knows about the vibrant IT section, information technology sector, that has clients across the globe. And there's a flourishing agricultural sector that is a very important driver of the economy and something we're very focused on at the embassy. Rule of law has made some improvement, and I think the Armenian courts, though there's still serious problems, are increasingly rejecting the Soviet approach that they inherited from the Soviet Union. Very importantly, to Armenia's credit, it is taking a very important role on the international stage. It has a more confident foreign policy, and it is playing a role in the international security system. In particular, the U.S. government is very pleased, and we praise Armenia for its strong, long-term participation in NATO missions in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, UN peacekeeping operations in Lebanon, and very soon in Mali. I mention this because I think it is important, amidst all the challenges that Armenia faces, and I think we all know in this room that there are deep challenges, that we emphasize the progress that has been made, because it should give all of us, certainly gives me, inspiration to tackle the serious challenges and to be optimistic about what can be achieved for Armenia's future and for the U.S.-Armenian relationship. And I'll be clear, despite the great strides that have been taken, much remains to be done to achieve what is the overarching U.S. foreign policy goal in Armenia, which I'm confident is also the goal of everyone in this room. The goal, simply, is a democratic, prosperous, secure Armenia at peace with its neighbors. This goal informs all my priorities as ambassador. It informs how we spend the assistance money Congress gives us and the range of programs that we undertake in Armenia. I'm going to speak about those 4 priorities in a few minutes, but before I do, I want to acknowledge the 2 important regional foreign policy issues that remain a focus for the U.S. government and for the embassy. That is the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Turkey's relations with Armenia. I have to admit, returning to this account, returning to Armenian issues after 20 years, it is frustrating, it is disheartening that after the ceasefire has been in place for 20 years, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict remains unresolved. The border with Turkey remains closed. To advance some progress, some resolution on both these issues, the U.S. government continues to pursue government-to-government efforts at the highest levels, and we support people-to-people and business-to-business initiatives across, especially the Turkish-Armenian border, that can build connections, create space, especially in Turkey, for frank dialogue between Armenians, Turks, and Azerbaijanis about their history and about the current issues that divide the region. More specifically on Nagorno-Karabakh, the U.S. government remains committed to helping the parties reach a peaceful, negotiated settlement via the Minsk Group process. We are firm in the belief, which we tell all sides, there can be no military solution to the conflict, no military solution that will be lasting. The embassy supports the work of Ambassador Warlick, as you know, the U.S. co-chair, and we share with him the views of the Armenian government on the process and what the Armenian people think about the process and their concerns and issues. Let me just say here, because I've gotten this question the last couple of days since I've arrived in the States, and that is the tension between Washington and Moscow that has developed over Ukraine and Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Is that affecting our ability to work in the Minsk process? And the short answer is no. I talked to Ambassador Warlick, and he tells me that his Russian co-chair remains engaged. They continue to focus, they continue to talk, and they remain active in the process. The Russian government itself in Moscow at the highest levels remains committed to the process. So we, as I think President Obama has said, are able to point to this as an example of how, even though we have strong differences about Russian behavior in Ukraine, where we have a common interest, like in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, we will work together, and we still are. With regard to Turkey, the U.S. government view remains that both sides need to keep the door open to efforts at normalization, at opening the border, and dialogue. And we press for the government of Turkey to implement the 2009 protocols, which we still believe will promote prosperity and stability on both sides of the border. And we are very clear that the ball is in the Turkish court. They need to move forward on the protocols. While I'm on the subject of Turkey, Armenia, I just wanted to take a minute because I think it's important to share with you what an emotional experience it was for me, was for everyone at the embassy, to be in Yerevan on April 24th last year. I had the honor of joining the presidential delegation that was headed by Secretary of the Treasury Liu, that traveled to Yerevan along with several congressmen to represent President Obama and the government of the United States on this very most solemn of occasions. And we all stood in remembrance with the Armenian people. I had the honor to stand with the Secretary, as Armenian officials, clergy, other dignitaries from around the world gathered to remember and to acknowledge the 1.5 million Armenians who were massacred or marched to their deaths 100 years ago at the end of the Ottoman Empire. I think the remembrance events touched everyone at the embassy. They certainly did me. I was also very deeply impressed by the many commemorative ceremonies and events that were organized by the Armenian government and by the diaspora in the United States, many other countries. And during April and May of last year, many of them had quite an impact inside Armenia, especially the ecumenical service at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. I'm sure you've all seen the photos from the event, which was attended by Vice President Biden, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Power, President Sargsyan, Foreign Minister of Armenia Nalbandian, and of course both the Calicos Karakan II and the Calicos Aram I. That event, the pictures, had quite an impact, I think, in Armenia. Let me now turn to my main goal for tonight, which is to discuss with you my 4 priorities as ambassador, which I think will help us achieve this goal of a democratic, prosperous, secure Armenia at peace with its neighbors. I developed these priorities after my first 6 months in country, taking time to speak to Armenians north, south, in business and government, civil society, and also, frankly, to many of the members of the Armenian-American community who were in Yerevan, especially for the Centennial Remembrance Commemoration, and could share with me their views and their thoughts. I announced these 4 priorities at a speech in November at the American Chamber of Commerce in Yerevan. I did this because, frankly, one of the things that we push hard, one of our messaging in Armenia, is the need for greater transparency, greater accountability throughout the government and in the society. So I thought it was only fair that I say to the Armenian people, here are my priorities. Here are what we're going to be working on. You can measure how successful we are in the next year, in the next 2 years. And given the importance that this community, all of you, plays inside of Armenia, I wanted to share these priorities with you, and so that you might each consider if there are areas that you could cooperate with us, messaging you could send when you're in Armenia, or talking to Armenians that you know. Quickly, in a nutshell, these 4 priorities are: we want to deepen the business and trade relations between the 2 countries. Second, we want to give public backing and assistance to Armenians who are fighting the scourge of corruption. Third, we want to strengthen democratic institutions and human rights and civil society. And lastly, something the embassy needs to do: a better job of explaining U.S. foreign policy to Armenians so that they can understand the goals of U.S. foreign policy around the world, and they can have an accurate piece of information so they can assess the credibility of what they hear and what they read in the Russian media, which still pretty much shapes Armenian citizens' views of the world. Let me talk about each of those quickly in a little more depth. First priority: deepen business trade relations between the 2 countries. Let me be clear, I'm not talking about new aid, new assistance, programs designed to reform, but trade. In shorthand, trade, not aid. The strengthening of joint commercial ties will benefit both our countries. And I think we can focus on this because the Armenian economy has reached a certain level of sophistication that offers significant opportunities for commercial relations and investments in a number of sectors: energy, agriculture, tourism. So much so that last year, this past fall, we launched a new high-level forum to explore ways to develop the economic partnership between the countries. It's called the U.S.-Armenia Council on Trade and Investment, a TIFA in diplomatic speak. And the first TIFA was held last year. What the TIFA does is it's an agreement by both governments to say we will meet once or twice a year, sit down at a table after we've talked to our private sector, after we've talked to business people who tell us, here are the barriers to trade. Here's why we can't reach the U.S. market. Here's why we can't reach the Armenian market. And both governments agree to sit down and try and work those issues out. What I thought was particularly important about the first meeting, to be honest, I had doubts. I had doubts that the Armenian government would know how and be comfortable reaching out to the private business sector in Armenia and saying what doesn't work. Because that's kind of tough for any government to do. But they did. They reached out, and they got some very good input from business people in Armenia who want to trade with the U.S. and have problems. And the Armenian government put those issues in front of the TIFA Council. So that's very positive. Another thing that's very positive, I think, is we've seen some significant foreign U.S. investment into Armenia. Just last year, a U.S.-based energy firm, Contour Global, completed a $150 million purchase of the Voroton hydroelectric cascade, or power plant. This is the largest single U.S. private investment in Armenia. It's the first U.S. investment in the energy sector, which is very, very important. To encourage more U.S. investment, we're doing lots of things at the embassy. Last September, we held a franchise day, which attracted several U.S. companies that were interested in franchise opportunities in Armenia. And in October, we hosted a U.S. partnership opportunity delegation, which had several Armenian-American members that came to learn more about the clean energy sector in Armenia and what the possibilities are for investment there. Again, these are small steps, but they're important steps because they get Armenia, they get the market in Armenia known and brought to the attention of U.S. business people. This spring, we have plans to organize a private equity conference, the idea being to take U.S. private equity firms, investment firms, bring them to Armenia to show them the creativity, the energy, the ingenuity that we see in Armenia, and get them excited about investing in the development of some of these areas into viable businesses. And I would be amiss if I didn't talk about the information technology sector in Armenia. This is an area in which Armenia enjoys a terrifically strong competitive advantage. And this sector has grown in part because of the assistance of the U.S. government. We're very proud of our contributions to the IT sector. In particular, several public-private partnerships that we have put into place to help the sector grow. One of the most interesting, most important of these is the Microsoft Innovation Center in Armenia. This is a partnership between the U.S. government and Microsoft that assists students studying information technology, brings them together, as well as new startup companies, professionals from the United States, and helps all these people create innovative products, new services, shows them how to bring them to market, and how you build a competitive business. This center, the Microsoft Center in Yerevan, is one of only a handful of very top-notch startup, what we call accelerators, that exist in Central and Eastern Europe. To date, it has supported 100 startups in Armenia and has brought many of them to Silicon Valley for network opportunities, to link with investors and promotion. So this is all good and all positive, and the embassy wants to see more of this happen. But of course, it is not the U.S. Embassy's job. It is not the U.S. government's job, nor would it be in our capabilities if it was, to make U.S. business invest in Armenia. It is up to Armenia to attract that investment, as it did with Contour Global. And of course, fundamentally, companies invest where there's predictability, there's transparency, there's equal treatment, whether it's taxes or customs regulations, to court proceedings. So we're very much focused on measures that work to create a predictable business environment in which all companies, U.S., Armenian, Russian, Chinese, can compete fairly. This will increase investor confidence. So this is one of the reasons behind our second priority, which is the fight against corruption. I'll be honest, I have been very frank, and will continue to be frank, in public and private, with our Armenian friends. Government officials, the media, Facebook chats, civil society, about the very real toll that corruption is taking in Armenia. One of those tolls is economic, because of course, when competition is not fair, it becomes impossible for small and medium businesses to grow, foreign investment doesn't come. But corruption affects more than the economy. It undermines democracy, it undermines the rule of law, it breeds instability, and more importantly, and devastatingly, it builds mistrust and cynicism in a population that doesn't trust its institutions. And ultimately, corruption threatens national security. A state that is corrupt is very much prone to being influenced from outside by other governments. It hastens immigration. It causes brain drain that can seriously jeopardize the long-term health of Armenia. When I speak about corruption, I'm of course very clear. It exists everywhere. It exists here in the United States. We know that. But the key question is whether a nation has the political will to attack corruption, whether the media, civil society feel empowered to speak out against corruption, and whether there are reliable judicial and legal processes to investigate and prosecute cases. Let me say, I think there has been progress in reducing the level of corruption in the average Armenian's day-to-day experiences with his or her government. I think the average Armenian dealing with the government in terms of its basic services, whether that's a passport, a driver's license, getting your child into school, hospital care. Government's more transparent. There's much more government activity on computer systems. For instance, 97% of Armenians now pay their taxes electronically. This is good. There's less chance for people-to-people interaction where graft or bribery or extortion can happen. This has been a big project for us to get the government more transparent. That's all to the good. What has gotten, I think, worse, and is a serious, serious issue, is the predatory use of economic and political power by people at the top of the pyramid to restrict competition, to drive competitors out of business, to keep markets closed. That's very difficult to fight. So, what is the embassy doing on the issue? Very quickly, we're partnering with non-governmental and government institutions that will demonstrate to us commitment to fight corruption. When it comes to civil society, non-governmental organizations, the embassy gives small grants to support projects by local NGOs and media organizations that will shine a spotlight on corruption and combat it. But as important as engagement with civil society is, it's also important to tackle corruption through political will, and the government has to be engaged in the fight. So that is why we also work with government institutions that have pledged to fight corruption. And in doing so, we will condition our assistance to the government on attainable measures of success. In the case of USAID, for instance, which has been providing assistance to the government's Anti-Corruption Council, which is implementing an anti-corruption strategy, we've been clear. We will work with the government as long as it shows measurable results. If it doesn't, then we will walk away and our aid will cease. And USAID has partnered with institutions, ministries, where again we've seen demonstrated commitment from the top in that ministry to work on the issue. I know there's a lot of skepticism about this. I hear often that it's a waste of time, it's a waste of resources to engage with the government on this issue. I understand that skepticism. But I have to say, I have seen, my staff has seen, there are voices in the government that want to address this issue. And I believe targeted initiatives can reduce corruption in the lives of Armenians. Let me give you one success story, one example of, I think, some progress. USAID and the World Bank worked with the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs to automate the pension and social benefit system. This increased transparency, made it easier for the public to find out what their public benefits were, what they were owed. And the automated system that we put in helped the ministry update the pension recipient lists. And surprise, when we did that, we found out there were hundreds, thousands of people on the rolls who were long dead, but still receiving pensions. Or at least someone was receiving their pension. Thanks to that program, the ministry was able to clear the rolls, and they saved enough money to raise benefits for real pensioners by 15% per year for 2 consecutive years. I think that is something we can be all proud of. Part of the project, too, was to set up a 114 hotline, a phone number where citizens could call to get information about their benefits, what they were owed, but also to report fraud, or to say, I was just called by someone who said if I paid them something, they would increase my pension. I visited the center last August, a surprise visit. I met with several of the telephone operators. And while I was there, I actually saw them field calls. I heard them talking to Armenians who had phoned to raise serious concerns about fraud. Visits such as that one and conversations I've had with Armenians across the country reinforce my belief that corruption can be fought. It's not accepted by the Armenian people. I've been in posts, other places in the world I won't name, but when you raise this issue, what you hear is, hey, this is how we do business here. Don't bring your values from the United States to my country. Well, we don't hear that in Armenia. What I hear in Armenia is we don't want this to be the way we do business. And that, to me, is the biggest, most optimistic thing. That's 80% of the battle. Real quick, let me turn to the other 2 priorities. Our continuing effort to strengthen civil society, human rights, democratic institutions is a continuing priority. It's been a priority for the embassy since independence. And let me say there's been progress, I think. Armenia certainly deserves credit for what it has achieved. Let me say I'm very particularly encouraged by civil society. There is a very robust, active civil society in Armenia that doesn't hesitate to voice criticism, even criticism of the U.S. Embassy sometimes, and to propose solutions, and that's very powerful. We continue to work with civil society, whether it's women's groups or environmental groups or groups that are working to address the problem of wounded veterans from the Karabakh War, to take the lead and pushing for reforms that they want to see in the country. But we tell them It's time for them to begin now developing their own advocacy, their own sustainability plans. They need to become financially sustainable. They need to be turning to the Armenian people, to the diaspora, to corporations, even perhaps to run their own businesses so they can be self-sustaining and not so much depend on outside assistance, whether it's from us or the European Union or the UN or the Council of Europe. When they start to do that, they'll better reflect what the Armenian people want them to be talking about, and they won't think that they need to talk about what Brussels wants or the US Embassy wants or some other outside group. There's a long-awaited Armenian draft law on NGOs, which is pending in Parliament. We expect it to pass very soon, that will create the legal basis for civil society, for groups to have the authority to start businesses, raise money, invest, and then live off the income. Things that sound natural to us, but are still not really legally accepted in Armenia. They can crowdsource, they'll be able to fundraise through social media. This is all very good, and I think it will strengthen civil society over time. But the next few years will be tough for civil society in Armenia. They're going to have to learn to stand on their own 2 feet. We will try and help them as much as we can, but this will be tough for them, and many of them will, I think, be turning to the diaspora for support and assistance. And let me just say NGOs are important because they do so much in Armenia, whether it's providing pro bono legal services to a human rights prisoner, whether it's organizing charity drives to support Syrian refugees, supporting victims of trafficking in persons. They do all of this. And we will continue to support them. We will continue to support human rights in every way that we can, and to speak publicly and privately about it. Let me turn now to my 4th priority, which, as I said, is for the embassy itself. And that's to do a better job of talking about U.S. policies around the world and goals, not just concerning Armenia, but what the U.S. sees for the world as a whole, what our role is while we want the world to act and to be. As I was traveling around last summer, I met many Armenians, young, old, in Yerevan, outside of Yerevan, who told me they didn't understand U.S. foreign policy. It's difficult for them to get information about it. I think the embassy had been doing a very good job of talking about U.S.-Armenian ties, the values we share, the history we have together, why it's important that the U.S. and Armenia be friends. But there wasn't a good job, I think, of talking about why we're concerned about Russian aggression in Ukraine, why we're doing what we're doing in Syria, climate change, North Korea, what's happening in East Asia, these kind of issues. And that means to me that the embassy had to do a better job of talking about these issues. So, just this past month, I delivered remarks on U.S. foreign policy to 3 university-level audiences, some young professionals. People in the embassy have been reaching out to talk to high school kids, church groups. During all these interactions, we answer questions, we listen, we share information about U.S. goals in Europe. Again, with the goal of giving Armenians information about what the U.S. wants for the world, how we see the international community, so that they have the information to assess what they hear from the Russian media, which I think, as many of you know, really dominates the media space in Armenia. And this is important not just because it's in our interest to talk about what we want to do in the world, but because we want Armenia to be confident and comfortable itself on the world stage. Armenia and the U.S. share in many ways the same goals for the world, the same values. We differ on some issues. We do that with many of our friends, even our closest friends in Europe. But overall, we want Armenia to be able to achieve its own diplomatic and security goals. But to do this, the government needs a population that understands foreign policy issues, can make its own decisions about the accuracy of the information it's receiving, and will support the government taking an active role in foreign policy issues. So, this will be a goal and an effort the embassy will make in the coming years. And let me just say at this point, the government of Armenia has played and is playing a fairly sophisticated role in the international stage. It is doing a very good job of balancing the tightrope it finds itself given the region that Armenia exists in. It works with Moscow, it works with the European Union, it works with the United States. I think it's a great credit to Armenia that it is the only member of the CSTO, which many of you may know as the Russian-led defense security organization, sort of a counterpart to NATO. Armenia is the only member of the CSTO that also engages with NATO in active engagements, military training exercises, and has a strong relationship with the U.S. in terms of military reform. We're working very closely to help improve the operations, the leadership of the Armenian military. At the same time, Armenia plays a big role in the United Nations. It succeeded in passing a very forward-looking resolution last year on genocide prevention, war crime prevention, that I think was a great message in the centennial year. It plays a role in peacekeeping, as I mentioned. President Obama chaired a peacekeeping summit last September here in New York. This is one of President Obama's legacy issues, is how to improve peacekeeping in the world. 25 countries were invited. Armenia was one of them at the table, which is pretty darn good for a country of 3 million people. So I salute the Armenian government and its diplomacy and its ability to play on the world stage and take on issues of concern to the entire international community. I'm going to end here. I hope this overview of the Embassy's 4 priorities has been useful, informative, not too long. Let me conclude by emphasizing again my key message to all of you, friends of Armenia, supporters of the relationship. I've seen many positive changes in Armenia since I first started working on Armenian issues in the 1990s. Changes that have benefited the Armenian people, changes that we as Americans can be proud that we helped instigate and that we helped give the Armenian people the tools to achieve. More needs to be done. And I believe the 4 priorities that we are working on at the Embassy, deepening our trade relationship, fighting corruption, strengthening civil society and human rights, and explaining U.S. foreign policy to Armenians, are the priorities that will help the people, the government of Armenia, find Armenian solutions to the challenges they face. The diaspora, all of you in this room, has been and will continue to be an enormous source, not just of resources, but of strength and of partnership to the Armenian people. They want to hear what you think. They need to have these messages amplified. I know many Armenians are concerned that many in the diaspora look at them and feel, I can't deal with them. The corruption is too much. They want to hear from you another message. They want to hear from you. You understand their struggle. You're ready to support them. You'll stand with those that fight corruption. You'll stand with those that fight to promote human rights, of which there are quite a few in Armenia. And all of you, you are a way to link Armenia and the Armenian people to the expertise of the West, to students, teachers, professionals, farmers, and that's an incredible, valuable resource for the people of Armenia.
Դեսպան Միլսին լսելուց մտածում ես գուցե իրավ մեր երկիրը Հայաստանը կարող է վստահելի գործընկեր դառնալ Ամերիկայի համար, քանի որ կարծես փոխվում է աշխարհի քաղաքականությունը։ Կարծես Թուրքիայի հանդեպ արևմուտքը կորցնում է իր վստահությունը, աշխարհին արդեն հայտնի է Ադրբեջանի ոչ վստահելի եւ բռնատիրական քաղաքականությունը։ Գուցե սա է պատճառը, որ աշխարհի հզոր երկիրը փորձում է այդ շրջանում վստահելի գործընկեր գտնել, անշուշտ երկուստեք շահավետությամբ։ Ըստ իս ուրախալի երևույթ է։ Բայց այստեղ մենք անելիք ունենք, մենք Ամերիկայում բնակվող հայերս, նախ ցույց տալու մեր միասնականությունը, մեր ուժը եւ մեր երկրին թիկունք լինելը։ Բայց երբ որ նայում ես սրահին տեսնով շուրջ 150 մարդ, համայնքում մոտ 10 հեղինակավոր կազմակերպության նախաձեռնությամբ, մտածում ես, որ այդ ուժը եւ միասնականությունը չես կարող ցույց տալ, որն այս պարագայում շատ կարեւոր է։ Վատ կազմակերպչական աշխատանք, թե մարդկային անտարբերություն։ Բայց չէ որ մենք այսօր հապաղելու իրավունք չունենք, չէ որ մեր խնդիրները շատ են։ Մենք գրեթե ամեն օր Արցախի սահմանին երիտասարդ ենք կորցնում։ Թուրքիայի հետ սահմանների փակ լինելը անդրադառնում է մեր երկրի տնտեսության վրա, որի պատճառով նաև դատարկվում է երկիրը։ Վերջապես յուրաքանչյուր հայի հոգու անբուժելի վերքի 101 տարվա մեր նախնիների կոտորածների մինչ այսօր չընդունվելու հարցը։ Եվ այսպես հարցեր։ Կարծում եմ, որ սա էր տեղը, ուր պետք է լինեինք ոչ թե 150 հոգի, այլ 1500։ Եվ մեր միասնական առաջարկներով ու պահանջներով դիմեինք նախագահի ներկայացուցչին, որն էլ այդ միասնականությունն ու ուժը ներկայացներ նախագահ Օբամային, որն իր հերթին չզգուշանար օգտագործելու Armenian Genocide արտահայտությունը։ Չգիտեմ, գուցե ճիշտ եմ, գուցե սխալ, բայց կարծում եմ նման հնարավորությունը պետք էր օգտագործել, անելով լավագույնը, չէ որ աշխարհի քաղաքականությունը փոխում են մարդիկ, ուժեղները։ Եթե այդպես է, ապա ինչու ոչ մենք։